Dealing with two-dimensional art, we're going to start with media, which means the method, process, or means of expression. And in this case, we're starting with drawing. Now, when we think of drawing, we always think of dry forms. That's usually a definition in people's minds. If it involves a brush or a liquid, it often moves to painting. But we're going to see that's not always the case. We're going to be dealing with dry media and then wet media. In terms of dry media, we have pencil, charcoal, pastel, and graphite. And each has its purpose. This is why an artist would choose one media over another. When we get to pencil is great for fine detail, like we see here, an almost photorealistic image. But you'll notice the darks aren't quite pitch black. So it lacks some element of contrast. Depending on what you're doing, this may be quite useful. But the fact that I can sharpen it to a very fine point allows for all of this wonderful detail. Artists will often work with charcoal. Now, charcoal allows for really dark darks and really light whites. This is fantastic, but you can't detail it as much. Now, charcoal is often used for the human form because there are not a lot of fine details when I'm looking at the entire human figure. But the ability to shade really beautifully in charcoal works really well with the roundness of the human form. Then we have pastel. Now this could be dry pastel or could be oil pastel. Dry pastel you probably used at some point in grade school or high school. It may have been called crayon or chalk. Same basic principle. It functions very much like charcoal, except we have the addition of color. The downside of it is, unlike oil paints, for example, it's less controllable and therefore prone to muddy. In other words, you start blending the colors and very rapidly you'll get to browns and grays when what you were looking for were bright, vibrant tones. And finally, graphite. And you're sitting there going, well, don't be foolish. We know pencils are made of graphite, and you already covered pencils, so it's got to be the same thing. But it's not. Graphite here is a large rectangular chunk of graphite, and it mixes many of the ideas of pencil, where I can sharpen it to a certain amount of a point, and it mixes that with some of the blending ability of charcoal. The problem is, once again, your darks are very limited, as we can see in the shadows here. Those shadows are maybe a gunmetal, and that's as dark as I can get it, not giving me the contrast that I might want if I want a really three-dimensional form. Because the more contrast I have, the more three-dimensional our brain reads it. So, very useful. But these are our dry media. Now, when it comes to drawing, there are also wet media. There's wash and brush and pen and ink. Wash and brush is generally a monochromatic form used to do a study for later painting. Now, you have to imagine a world before cameras, and artists were frequently walking around with pads of paper, and they might have a block of watercolor, a brush, and a little bit of water. And what they could do with that is do a quick sketch that they would then move to a painting later on in the studio. So it becomes very effective for capturing shadows, capturing chiaroscuro, which is the interaction of light and shadow. It's a term we'll be dealing with in a couple of sections, so you don't have to worry about writing it down now. But it captures that movement of light over the surface very, very effectively. Then we have pen and ink, and this doesn't have to be fancy pens. You don't have to dip the pen in ink. This could be the ballpoint pen that you're saying they're taking your notes with right now, that you're doodling with in the corner. The advantage of pen and ink is you can have incredible detail. The disadvantage is it's entirely binary. There either is ink or there isn't. You can't blend it. So the only way to blend it is something called cross-hatching, or different forms of it, such as right there, where you're creating the illusion of blending even though it isn't. And pen and ink, like I said, would be your ballpoint pen or anything else. So very effective and very useful.